Thanks, sweet. Quick question though, did you start the recording by any chance? The start broadcast button up at the top?
I did, yes.
Okay, sweet.
Oh, oh, that was awesome.
All right. So let's give him another round of applause and welcome back.
Thanks, y'all. Glad to be with you. Yeah, so to start, just a little bit about myself. Um, so currently I work for these folks, Mass Relevance. We are located here in Austin, Texas. We either build or power experiences like this here for Major League Baseball, or this that you might have seen for the last Olympics, or President Obama's Twitter town hall. Pretty much if you see Twitter appearing on television, then it was probably us that was powering it. In fact, I think we are coming soon to your very own CBC. And some of my previous gigs, also all of these companies were either located now or at one point in Austin. We also have this in common. We are all hiring thoughtful Ruby developers. So if you need a job, then I would recommend that you learn Ruby. And another great reason is, of course, the subject of today's talk. And so if you're here, you're off to a great start. Otherwise, you have probably been at it for years, and you just want me to shut up and get on with it. Righto, here we go. So as front-end developers, we kind of have a bit of a quandary, and that is that the amount we've needed to know over time in order to consider ourselves competent front-end developers has increased pretty substantially. So back in 1995, right around the time that my Alanis Morissette reference there would have been at all relevant, it was pretty much just HTML, right? It was paragraphs, lists, blank tags, you know, all that stuff. You are all set. And then in 1997, we've got CSS and JavaScript. We start thinking about separating our style from our content, making that content dynamic. And then in 2005, the term Ajax is coined and starts giving people headaches. And then in 2007, we have even more headaches with mobile development. And all right, 2013, we've got CSS3, HTML5. It's just a version bump, right? We're all set. Well, let's start to unpack that a little bit. So CSS3 really comprises animation and 2D, 3D transforms and fonts, and HTML5, you've got this host of new semantic elements and local storage and video and audio and geolocation, and JavaScript is MVC and AMD, and really it's just evolved into a series of acronyms at this point. Plus you got the coffee script and the espresso script and the latte script, and you'll probably want to know about this stuff here as well, and maybe have a passing familiarity with all of these things, and then you've also got these libraries, and before you know it, you're dealing with a tag cloud, right? And as we know, everybody hates tag clouds, right? So hold on to your hats, folks, for this even more stunning conclusion. The explosive growth of the web has really dramatically increased the complexity of front-end development. And our tools haven't always really kept pace. So how do we start to tackle some of this complexity with a tool that we know well, Ruby? So let's start from the foundations. Markup. So let's take a look at some HTML, some of the how to make a living. So this is a very simple example, and every element, as we know, has an opening and closing tag. So I've got my div here with a paragraph tag inside of it. And let's take a look at a slightly more complex, totally contrived example. So I've got this div with an unordered list and a single list element inside, and it's got this span. But as I look at this, I get concerned. Because do I really need to be closing all of these tags? You know, computers really ought to be able to figure this out for me. That's robot work. So it's not so much that it's a pain to write. I can configure my editor to close the tags, but it does clutter the document, makes it a touch more difficult to understand the structure if you're looking at a very large, very complex nested file, and just to read things generally. And since we spend most of our time reading code and not writing code, that's important. So one of the first attempts at tackling some of the complexity of markup with Ruby was Markaby. Now, this was released in 2006, and if you're fortunate enough to recognize that blog header there, you know it's from our very own Why the Lucky Stiff. If you don't recognize it and you don't know who I'm talking about, Google Wise Poignant Guide, get to know him. The illustrations I use across this presentation were borrowed from Y. And as a quick aside, here's how dumb I am. I didn't notice until I was putting this talk together that the hands are in the background of the red-handed header there. That's just how dumb I am. Anyhow, so we can see what he's doing here with the Ruby is he's using it to capture and treat his links as strings, and he's appending those together with pipes, and then we get that little 5 bits inspect series of links in his header there. So if we take a look at that example from earlier, this is what it's going to look like in MarkerBean. So we see each element is a method. We're using blocks to nest elements and our content. Because it's Ruby, all of the blocks must be closed, right? So it doesn't really solve the particular problem of closing tags because we're still closing all of these blocks. So Python and other white space significant languages figured this out, right? So Haml, which was also released in 2006 by Hampton Catlin, and I believe it's maintained now by Nathan Weizenbaum, it added that concept of significant white space to the mix. So now I don't have to bother with closing all these tags. The Haml interpreter just sees the indentation, recognizes the significant white space, and does the rest for me. So it also gives us a shorthand for things like IDs, classes, attributes, does lots of other cool stuff. So you can see up at the top there, I've got the div with an ID of comments. I'm using % signs to denote new elements. The ul.fancy just means it's a ul with a class of fancy. I denote all of my attributes by using a hash there. And I don't want to start a religious war. I know that there are a lot of feelings about Haml on both sides, but it's hard to argue that this isn't a much terser, assuming that terser is a word syntax. So an even terser syntax would be Slim. Slim is a relatively new entrant onto the scene of Ruby HTML preprocessors, but it started as an experiment to see just how much code could be removed from standard HTML. So at first glance, we can see we've lost those % signs to denote new elements. And really, this is just about the fewest number of keystrokes you can get to produce usable markup. A few differences as well, where you've got a different style for denoting our attributes. But really, as we can see, Haml and then Slim being the king of the terseness contest there. And really, these are all great ways to make it easier to comprehend the structure of our documents, to make them more readable, therefore more maintainable, and really just to allow us to write more markup faster. But we're not going to get through things with content alone. We also need to make sure our sites look nice. So good design helps with the success of any project, but sometimes our style sheets can get needlessly complex. So how can we start to simplify our style sheets with Ruby? Let's start by taking a look at some of the problems with our beloved CSS. So if you talk to a neckbeard, a wise, learned coder about CSS, they always have some problems with it, right? It doesn't do what they think it should. So what are some of those problems? Well, for starters, nesting, right? Why am I saying nav ul and then nav ul li? I'm styling up a navigation element here. I don't need to be doing that. And then variables, right? I've got this color red listed twice. What if I want it to be blue? I have to go through and find change for red. That's totally ridiculous. And functions. I don't have functions either, right? So enter Sass, which was given to us by the same folks that created Haml. They, in fact, built it as Haml for style sheets. Here we're looking at SCSS, which is Sass's cousin. It's actually now the default in new Rails projects. And it allows us to do some really cool stuff. Like, you can see I can nest my selector there. So rather than saying nav ul and nav ul li, I just nest it inside of that ul element. I can also nest my attributes. So rather than font weight, font style, and font size, I nest them there inside of that font block. I can also use variables. So I'll say, well, I want my text color to be red, and then I'll just use that text color variable in a couple of places. Then I can just make that change in one place, and you'll know how variables work. I'll just skip over that. So variables are really where Sass starts to look like CSS from the future. So if I've got this callout div and I'm defining some attributes of its border, I can say I want it to have this particular color of green, and then my default border width is 5 pixels. But inside of this callout div, I want to multiply that default width by 2, or I want to apply this darken function to that original color. So then I can set this one kind of base color for a theme, and then by using these darken and lighten functions, I can just make one change to that color, and then essentially have reskinned my entire site. Mixins, these are the functions of Sass. So here I'm defining this index table mixin. And I'll say for index tables, I want everything in the header row to have a bold font, and I'll go ahead and zebra stripe that table. So then for my table with a class of users, I want that to just incorporate all of those styles. Now, one project that makes heavy use of the mixin functionality and is built on top of Sass is called Compass. It refers to itself as a CSS authoring framework. So with Compass, we get a host of CSS3 mixins, layouts, some typography patterns. So let's take a look at some of this. So one of the really basic CSS3 mixins in Compass is border radius. So I've got this class of round in here, and I say include that border radius mixin. Its default border radius will be 5 pixels, but since that's a mixin, I can actually have arguments and set that to 10 pixels, whatever. And then that's going to get interpreted down to the vendor prefix CSS. And this is actually one of several CSS3 mixins that we get out of the box with Compass. So what's really great about this is we know we're always using the most up-to-date CSS3 declarations. So when things like border radius get adopted by more browsers and we can start dropping vendor prefixes, we don't have to worry about it. We don't have to worry about copy-pasting prefixes all over the place. It's generally just much more readable and more maintainable CSS. So Sass and Compass both offer some niceties for dealing with style sheets, but here's the real problem. What is this? Over time, you're working on a project and you just end up with these huge monolithic files for your style sheets. There's no real organization. Maybe you got some comments, but really it's just selector after selector, and oh, somebody thought to alphabetize them. Great, that makes a lot of sense. So nobody means to do this, right? It's just the sort of thing that happens over time in a project. So how can we start to address some of this complexity? So this comes from a blog post from Chris Epstein called Help My Style Sheets Are a Mess. So here my example is just an aside from the talk or the conference where I originally gave this talk, where the keynote speakers were Matt's and Uncle Bob. So I've got my little aside element, and then the H2, an unordered list, but it's not very cool, right? It's just default, just black and white. So let's make this awesome. Bam! Slap some sass on that, and suddenly it's the coolest thing you've ever seen. But really, it's still just a mess of properties. I can alphabetize them, but really, it's not going to help all that much. So I've got all of the styles for this aside here. So let's take a look at the typography. So I've got that font family declaration, and then the font weight and the font size. Well, let's pull that out. Let's create this class highlight text where I define the font, and it'll say what the size and the weight of my H2 elements. And then there in my aside, I can just extend that highlight text class. So extend is just going to pull in all of those style declarations. So let's go through again, and let's pull out everything that defines the container, like the box shadow, the border, the margin, the padding. We'll refer to that as a shadow box. And then let's define a dark background and a high contrast interface. So then when we look at this aside again, really it's just a series of extensions that are intelligently named, so it's much easier to comprehend the style, to comprehend the intent. And what's really cool is changes to those extended classes will now carry through the entire site. So my theme will stay consistent without having to go through and redefine these things in each one of these elements. So all I'm really doing here is defining how I want that UL to look, and everything else is very readable and thus much more maintainable. So if you want to create a new Compass project, you do it like this here, Compass create my site. Here I'm just saying to use Blueprint, which is, if you're unfamiliar, it's the Blueprint framework. Gives you some sensible typography, some cross-browser grid layout, so you don't have to worry about box model stuff. So to go over that one more time, when we're dealing with the complexity of our style sheets, we can use SCSS and Compass to kind of organize properties by container, by color, by typography. But when we're dealing with authoring abstractions like this, it's really a lot of recompiling. Plus, we have linters, hinters, minifiers. It's a lot of stuff to handle manually. So we need to automate our workflow. So a good way to do that with Ruby is with a gem called Guard. Guard is just a file system watcher. So it's super simple. I start out by setting up my Guard file in the root of my project. And so I'll say Guard Slim, so watch all my files with the .slim extension. Guard Compass, watch all the files with the .scss extension, and then run those commands to go ahead and compile those files anytime we see one of them change on the file system. Now, Compass does have Compass Watch, but this is nice because it's now part of a single automation suite that we've rolled ourselves. So what's really cool is when I bring new developers onto the project, I can just say bundle install, bundle exec guard, and they're all set. They've got their automation suite ready to go. And if you check out this blog post here from Vidget, you can see they've got some gist for things like handling minification, retina images, sprites, and there are also gems that add support for all kinds of stuff, compiling CoffeeScript, compiling Haml for doing live reload, for running your hinters or linters, Jasmine tests. But sometimes your needs might be a touch more specialized. So at Mass Relevance, we build custom visualizations of social media data. So over time, there was a lot of code that was shared between projects, a lot of different toolings developers wanted to use to build out those visualizations. So we rolled our own gem. You can find it up on GitHub. It's massrelevance/Vizr, V-I-Z-R. Now, the original version of this used Guard under the covers, but includes a lot of other tools that we needed on our own projects. Now, actually, since I first gave this talk, this tool has kind of evolved to use a few tools that are pretty new onto the scene and are actually based on JavaScript. So this will be a touch of a diversion from the original intent of the talk, but a lot of front-end automation in the community is moving this way, and it makes sense. When we were dealing with projects that are mostly HTML and JavaScript, so those developers would like to keep their tooling in JavaScript as well. And what were new projects at the time I gave the talk have now matured, and we even rewrote our Vizr project to make use of Grunt and Bower. So let's take a look at these. Grunt, when you're building a JavaScript library, you need to concatenate source files and compile CoffeeScript and run JSHint and minify things, and you can do this with a series of rake commands. And in fact, it's really handy to just think of Grunt as rake for JavaScript projects. But a lot of JavaScript developers would prefer to just do this with JavaScript. So this was released pretty recently, but it already has a huge community. It's very easy to incorporate plugins for Handlebars, CoffeeScript, Jade, Require.js, all the hot JavaScript stuff the cool kids are using these days. Bower, or Bower, I actually have no idea how it's pronounced, is essentially Ruby gems for JavaScript libraries. It's just a package manager for front-end libraries. This is very cool because really there was no standard way of doing this. It's essentially just copy down some files, stick them wherever you want them. But now I can just install the node package Bower. I can say Bower install, which installs all my dependencies. Then I can go ahead Bower install underscore to get the underscore library in there. It's a very, very cool project. It runs just runs over Git. It's package agnostic, so it can be AMD, Require.js, Bower, doesn't care. And so to tie all this together is a tool called Yeoman. This is released by Adi Osmani and several other people. It integrates Grunt and Bower into a really nice workflow. So you can see here I say yo web app, which is just scaffolding myself out a new site. Then I npm install and Bower install all of my dependencies. I say Bower install underscore again and install the underscore library for me. And then Grunt which is just, once again, prepare everything for deployment. So Yeoman also does some other really cool stuff, like handling image optimization, doing automatic compilation like Guard. It also has live reload integration. So if you're looking to automate your workflow, which you should definitely do, saves you tons of time, you can either do it yourself with Ruby, you can delve into JavaScript, or you can roll your own gem. So now that we've got all of our components, let's look at how we might build some static sites with Ruby. So Jekyll, if you are at all familiar with Ruby static site generators, this is one you will definitely have heard of. It bills itself as a blog-aware static site generator. So super simple. It's just based on this YAML configuration file, and then I have this post directory. It's also currently the engine behind GitHub Pages. If you haven't used it in GitHub Pages in a long time, as I had not, it's really cool. It has themes now, great for running your project page or portfolio page. And under the covers, it uses the tilt gem to handle a variety of different markup formats and uses Pigment for syntax highlighting for your blog posts. So if you're looking to build like a coding blog, you might want to look at Octopress, which is very, very popular now. It's built on top of Jekyll. It has this really pretty default theme, responsive layout, a sidebar with your tweets or your app.net updates if you're super cool, your GitHub repos. Now, Octopress takes a little heat sometimes because after it was released, a lot of blogs started to look suspiciously similar. But much like Twitter Bootstrap, it's something that's meant to be themed. If you spend just a little bit of time on it, you'll end up with something that's really cool. Now, why would I want to host my blog as a static site? Well, for one thing, I used to work for Metasploit, so I just cannot bring myself to use WordPress ever again. But let's say you get Slashdotted or Hacker News, and you don't want to worry about your server melting, and this way you don't have to. You either throw it up on GitHub Pages, you host it as a static site on S3, you let Disqus worry about their comment servers melting, and you are fine. So Middleman, this is one of my favorite static site managers for Ruby. Now it brings all the template helpers, but also handles minification and cache busting and compression. And it's also built on top of Padrino, which is another full stack Ruby framework like Rails or Sinatra. So it gives us things that we'd be familiar with from Rails, like layouts, helpers, templates, partials. These are all really handy things when you're building complex static sites. So let's take a look at building a sample project with Middleman. So one project you might see yourself tasked with is building an API documentation site for your product. And this is the type of thing that is just a perfect fit for Middleman. So I've built one here you can take a look at. It's up on GitHub at techpiece/API site base. So when I was creating this, I just started with a Compass Create API site base, and I want to use the Bootstrap Sass gem. Here I'm just using Twitter Bootstrap. If you're unfamiliar with Twitter Bootstrap, just very quickly, it was released by Twitter. It's just a series of reusable front-end components for web applications. If you started noticing all web apps looking exactly the same, like all blogs were looking the same, it was because of Twitter Bootstrap. And I'm saying I want to use the Sass version of that rather than less, as it's written in initially. And then I say middleman init, this API site base. I have to move a few files around into the source directory. But once I'm done with that, I'm going to see this here, which even has this like cool animation effect, which makes you think, wow, I just did something awesome, even though really you just ran 2 commands and moved some files around. So here I've got the layout for the site, which once again is in Slim. It's not important to read all of this, but because it's in Slim, the markup is very clear, very concise. And most of this, as you can see, is actually header. But up at the top there, I'm defining my body element. I'm setting the class to the result of the page class's helper. And then I'm rendering the partial nav bar. The reason we see 2 equal signs there is because Slim escapes HTML by default. So by using the double equal sign, I'm saying don't worry about escaping this and throwing up a bunch of puke on my site. So I've got my index template. Once again, very concise markup. I'm defining these rows, which is just some layout helpers that Twitter Bootstrap gives us. The span 12 is just part of their grid system. And then I this gets dropped into the layout where we see that container div with a yield. This should be familiar to Rails folks. We're just yielding the result of that template. So let's take a closer look at that markup again. So I've got this div with a class of row and a class of wells, and I'm using this well helper method a few times there. So as you can see, what it does there is I pass in a header for the well. A well is just another thing that Bootstrap gives us, kind of that rounded gray div that's offset from the layout a bit. So I pass in the header and then an image and then the text for the button there. So if you look inside of that helper, this is just one cool thing that Middleman gives us is access to the lorem ipsum gem. So really I'm just saying lorem.sentences3. You can do lorem.paragraphs. Really cool helper. Makes it super simple when you're prototyping layouts like this and you just need some lorem text. So here is our finished product. I put this together start to finish in about 30 minutes, for something that looks like this, for someone like myself who's typically not so great at visual design, in the past couple of years, we've really advanced the state of the art in terms of how quickly you can put prototypes together. Like I said, this is up on GitHub to peruse at your leisure, IA. And hey, if Middleman looks like it's not your bag, don't worry, because in the Ruby world, you have got serious options when it comes to static site managers. But hey, static sites, they're not going to make me any cash, right? So who cares? Well, let me introduce you to a buzz phrase you may have been unaware of. Backend as a service, or BaaS. There's another reason you might want to look at building a static site, and it's this right here. These folks will provide you with servers, with storage, and entire backend infrastructure, and a fair number of these providers have sprouted up in the past couple of years. Now, most of these are tailored specifically for mobile apps and provide SDKs for iOS or Android, but one of them, Parse, actually has a JavaScript SDK. Now, it's still meant to be used for mobile apps, but we can use it to build a static site, and that we're delivering the same static content to all our users that's still dynamic. So this means we'll be building the entire site in JavaScript and HTML, and the Parse SDK is actually based on Backbone. Since I am too lazy to build an example app from scratch, let's use the go-to resource for client-side MVC framework example apps. That is To-Do MVC. So this is a resource built by Adi Osmani again and several other folks, and it attempts to take pretty much every client-side MVC framework that exists and build the exact same to-do list application. It's trying to be the Rosetta Stone of client-side MVC frameworks. So the app itself looks like this. This is a really excellent resource for determining which MVC framework is going to fit your needs. Since they have a Backbone version, and since Parse is actually based on Backbone, it's really just a matter of converting the existing To-Do MVC for Backbone over to Parse. There's actually a handy guide for doing this very thing over at the Parse help site. So I start by creating my To-Do MVC app, and we go ahead and gank all the code for the Backbone app from To-Do MVC. I've got this up as well at GitHub at techpiece/todo-mvc parse. Don't worry if you aren't familiar with Backbone. We're not going to dive into it too deeply. But we'll start off by including the Parse JavaScript SDK. We'll call their initialize function with these super secret keys that no one else is ever going to see ever. And here we have our original model from the To-Do app. So it has some default values, as we can see. We've got this toggle function that just saves the model and toggles that completed Boolean symbol. So to change this over to a parse object, we'll change Backbone model to parse.object. Simple. Then we'll also add the class name to do, so it knows where we're going to map that on the parse backend. So, step 3. Let's take this to-do list Backbone collection, and we'll change that to parse.collection. All right, that was it. And then step 4. Okay, we are done. Wonderful. So let's go ahead and deploy this thing. Now this is going to be super tough. I'm going to click continue. and I'm going to sync that folder up to S3, and then it is deployed. Okay, so that took a few seconds. This is the coolest part of backend as a service providers. This site right now is hosted on S3. The deployment takes milliseconds, and we don't have to worry about it falling over suddenly if everybody's like, oh, holy crap, check out Matt's to-do list, it's the coolest thing. This is a really powerful paradigm. As more and more services like this come into being, we're going to have new ways to think about architecting our applications. So if you want to check that out for some reason, it is at todo.matthewbuck.com. This is a really simple example app. There's no concept of users. Everyone can see everyone else's to-dos. So go in there and start typing out curse words for everyone else to see. Just be sure to refresh because it doesn't pull, and refresh mercilessly. I don't care. I don't host the front end or the back end myself. I host nothing. So, since I initially wrote this presentation, another new service that has come onto the scene, backend as a service provider, is Backlift. This one is super, super cool. So let's try that whole process again, this time using Backlift. So we'll start by signing in, linking it to my Dropbox account. We'll see why that is here in a moment. All right, step one, I will create a new app. Wonderful. Step two, use the Backbone to-do template. Wonderful. Step three, oh, okay, no step three even. It's 2 steps, bam, done. To-do MVC is up. So this is super, super cool. It creates a folder on my Dropbox account, creates that same to-do app, and so we see it here inside of my Dropbox folder. I can just go ahead and open that up. Inside of there, I'll open that index.html, and I will just change that header from to-dos to super awesome to-dos, and then the process of deployment is save. I save the file. Then Dropbox syncs the file, and it is up. The change is reflected instantly. This is really, really neat. If this really changes the game in terms of throwing up super quick prototype sites. I was unable to find any pricing information. It is a very new service, but definitely worth checking out. These backend as a service providers, like I said, are really going to change the game in terms of the way we think about architecting our applications. So to go over that one more time, if we're building static sites, then Jekyll is the engine for GitHub pages, a great option for blogs, as is Octopress. You can use Middleman for managing a static site, or you can use Parse or Backlift as a backend as a service provider. And that is it, folks. Thank you so much. And I'll go ahead and take any questions if you want to demute yourselves there.
All right. Cool, cool. So you do have a few minutes for questions?
Definitely.
All right, thanks. Any questions, anybody? Did you hear that?
I did not.
Okay. They were asking if the slides are going to be available.
Yes, in fact, they already are. They're up on Speaker Deck. If you just search for my name, Tech Piece, up on Speaker Deck, you should find them. I'll go ahead and I updated a few of them. I'll go ahead and upload the most recent version.
All right, thanks. Any other questions? So I got one. There's a lot of stuff at the beginning there with the different potential toolkits you can use, and like choosing the slimmest thing isn't necessarily always the best choice. So what's your actual ideal setup right now?
I do actually. I prefer to use Camel in my projects just because it's. I think when you're evaluating any open source tool, obviously the size of the community is very important, and really that's. While I really like Slim, I take comfort in knowing that there are a lot more people working on the project. It's been around a lot longer, and it's easier to get my questions answered. So I tend to stick with Haml. Haml and SCSS are my go-to right now.
Cool. Any questions come up? I'll ask you another one. Do you have any other, like, what's your favorite, like, little lesser-known technique that you use right now with, either with, it could just be with the front-end stuff or just general Ruby tips or advice?
That is a good question. I can't really think of anything off the top of my head that's lesser known, really. I kind of covered everything that I know. I'm not very smart.
Okay, cool. Anybody else come up with anything? Oh, we got one coming up.
If you like the fact that Haml does not have ending statements, why do you prefer SCSS over Sass? Even it's very similar to the difference between HTML and Haml.
Yes, that's a good point. Really, the only reason I go with SCSS is because now that it's the Rails default, I can expect more projects, more gens that interface with Rails to use SCSS themselves, and when I bring new developers onto my team, I would expect more of them to be familiar with the SCSS syntax over the Sass syntax. But that is a good point. Yeah, definitely. If you're looking for the terseness and the readability, then Sass is a fine option. For me, it really just came down to what can I expect developers to know, and what is going to be more widely supported by the community.
Cool, thanks. Another question coming up?
What is your preference between Ember.js and AngularJS?
Honestly, I really only started looking at both of these projects. From my initial work with both of them, I would say that AngularJS at this point just seems easier to get started with. I know there's been a touch of drama around Ember recently with regards to their kind of getting started documentation. I'm sure Ember.js is going to be a super cool project. And once they kind of address that issue and it's the API is a touch more stable, I think it will be very cool. I think if I was going to do a side project where I wanted to toy with one right now, I'd probably use Angular, just because it would be easier for me about having to totally rewrite it in a couple of months.
Thank you. Any other? Oh, I got it.
What do you think of Meteor?
Meteor?
Yeah.
I think it's awesome. That's another one where I really just started looking at this stuff. I've been paying attention to it for a while. I think what excites me about Meteor is it kind of makes me feel the same way I did when I watched like the blog in 15 minutes video, which is what got me started with Rails. Just like, oh wow, this is probably the future. I should probably learn this stuff. I know when I first looked at it, there were a lot of concerns around kind of data security and things like that, which all seem to have been addressed. I think actually my next kind of investigation Spike side project thing will probably be with Meteor, just to kind of start getting a feel for that and deciding if I need to learn it so that I can have jobs in the future.
Any other questions, anybody? Not see any more questions. Do you have any final words of wisdom for the group?
You know, just keep trying to stay one step ahead. I think as Rails developers, what's really cool about this community is we try to stay on the cutting edge. So if you're here to use the group, you're obviously interested in doing that. So yeah, just try to see what's coming around the bend, stay on top of stuff, and keep making awesome things.
Just a quick question.
Oh, one more question, sir.
Yes.
Like SAS or CoffeeScript and all these things that you compile to the end product of your debugging. Like when you try to find the mistakes in the code in the end that's generated.
Did you hear that, or?
I didn't quite hear that. So you could summarize for us.
So he was asking about stuff like SAS and stuff like that are compiled at the end before being pushed to the server. How do you debug it? What did you want to maybe?
Oh, how do you find like exactly is it generating clean code or like clean HTML or clean CSS file?
So, is the question how do you debug the stuff that's being processed?
Yeah, and he's asking if it ends up being clean code at the end as well.
So there are different flags you can use for the different processors. So you can either say output minified code or output indented code. I find it to be very clean. One way you can kind of address the problem of debugging is something that really is just starting to make its way into the browsers, and that's called source maps. So I know there have been a few blog posts recently about how you can enable source maps in Chrome developer tools, and so that would then it just creates this mapping file. So I can, when I inspect an element, rather than showing me the line in the compiled CSS where it's defined, it will actually show me the line in my pre-compiled SCSS, and it will do the same thing with CoffeeScript as well. So that's really starting to kind of address that concern people had. I found that to be more of a problem, I guess, with styles than I ever did with CoffeeScript, just because it's easy to tell by looking at the compiled JavaScript where my problem is usually. But the source maps definitely helps a lot with that.
Thank you. Any other questions? No? All right. Well, thanks so much, Matt. We really appreciate you taking the time out to come and talk with us, and that was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, let's give him another round of applause.
Adios, y'all.
All right. Thanks. Cool. Have a great night. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, sure thing.
All right. Take it easy.